This is the Minnesota State Education Finance Committee, and we will now come to order. Before we begin, we have a new member. Senator Clark is with us. He's just joined us in this committee. And Senator Clark, would you take a minute to introduce yourself? And then when we began this session 3 weeks ago, we all answered the question, if you got to teach educational class, what class would you like to teach? What kind of a coursework would you be interested in?
Thank you, Chair Kunich. Pleased to be here. So I'm the state senator from Northeast Minneapolis, Southeast Minneapolis, and the University of Minnesota area. And professionally, I work in ethics at Medtronic. So I think if I were to teach a class, it would be ethics. That might not be as fun for the kids. I also coach track and cross country. So I think I could teach a running class as well. So ethics and running, I think, is my balance. Thank you, Chair.
Well, thank you for joining us today and joining this committee. I think we're going to have some, really good, robust conversations over the next session. And of course, our goal is to finance public education in the best way for Minnesota kids. This morning, we will have a presentation from the Department of Education on what federal funds Minnesota schools actually receive. Given the threats and the plans that are coming down from the Trump administration, I think it's really important that we understand how much of the public education dollars that we use to educate our students come from the federal government and the threat that those are under. We know that last week started really the terrifying dismantling of so many of the departments at the federal level, and especially we're hearing more and more about what's going to happen at the Department of Education. This week, I believe the Trump administration is going to perhaps use the executive actions to dismantle the U.S. Department of Education in Elon Musk's, who is not an elected official, so-called Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, to seize control of the federal spending and slash the size of government workforce. And that means our public education as well. And so I think it's really important that we understand what funds make up our public education here in Minnesota. Our federal funds make up 10% of our state's education budget. It totals over $1 billion for our schools. So that's really what is at risk, as well as other policies that might be coming down. So it's really essential that we look at this issue and that we continue to fight and advocate for our schools. And so I'm pleased to have the Department of Education here to explain to us and share with us what those dollars look like and the struggle that we might have as we try to put together a budget that is going to address the issues and the needs of our students. And so with that, I am going to call on Angela Mansfield, Assistant Commissioner for Education. If you would like to introduce yourself, and then you may begin.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman. I'm actually going to pass my mic over to Adosh Uni, our Director of Government Relations, to start us off this morning.
Okay. And Mr. Uni, would you just wait a minute? Senator Lang, you wanted to say something?
No, I just, first of all, again, welcome. Again, Madam Chair, I'm new to the committee, so, sorry, welcome. Here we go, right? So first day, we're going to go after the Trump administration. You're right, for sure, Madam Chair, you're in charge here. We'll watch it. We'll listen. We're talking about 10% of the funds, right? Last week, we heard all of these superintendents come through. I represent all of part of 22 school districts. I get we're going to talk about 10% of the budget, but let's remember who pays for 90% of it. Let's remember how Anoka Hennepin sat here and said we're $25 million short. I think in this room, we need to take a really close look at what we're doing. I think we need to pay attention to the mandates that we put on the schools in the last 2 years. I think we need to pay attention to what they're asking us. Every school district that came in front of us asked for that. Even the ones that supported you guys. right? They asked, please reduce these mandates. I know you're going to have to swallow a lot of pride on this one, but we need to have a plan how we're going to pay for the things that we need the school districts to do. We can't just talk about the federal government and worry about the 10%. We need to worry about the 90%. So by all means, folks from the front table, let us have it. We'll hear everything bad about the federal administration, but we really need to work on the state aspects of this. So thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, Mr. Adosh, are you ready?
Madam Chair, committee members, my name is Adosh Uni. I'm the Director of Government Relations for the Minnesota Department of Education. Today, with me, I have Assistant Commissioners Angela Mansfield and Darren Cordy to walk through what the federal funds are for the state of Minnesota. And we'll give a little bit of background on the process and on some of the major streams. So, you know, as the chair mentioned, there is some currently, you know, in the last several weeks, some confusion, some delay with what is the status at the federal level, and especially around what information is coming from the federal level around federal funds, and some lack of clarity around the current U.S. Department of Education. We at the Department of Education do understand and feel the frustration too that is being experienced by the field, families all around the state, and decision makers here and around the state. And we are grappling with the lack of clarity like everyone else. However, we would like to provide some clarity on how the federal funds Minnesota receives work as they are currently situated. We hope that this provides the committee with important information on how Minnesota students and schools benefit from the critical federal investments and how they're distributed under currently developed and established processes and systems. As I mentioned, the bulk of our presentation is going to focus on the major federal streams that the state of Minnesota receives. And then I'll briefly talk before we go into that about the federal funds review and approval process as it relates to the legislature's involvement in that process. And then some of the highlighted federal funds are going to be the ESEA Title funds, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, nutrition funds, a charter school grant, Perkins, McKinney-Vento, and a couple other areas that we're going to detail. My colleagues here will detail. One thing that I want to note first off is that was mentioned is the magnitude of the funds that we receive from the federal government. It is, as you can see here, it is 10% of the funds that are spent on education in the state of Minnesota. 90% is by state and local funds. But that does, in the prior fiscal year, that was $1.43 billion. In fiscal 25, it's 1.44. There is a slight drop off to just under $1 billion and then back to $1 billion. And this is related to the end of the ESSER and ARP dollars that came in 2020, 21, and 22. There were several years for districts and states to be able to exercise those funds. And so the impact lasts through this fiscal year with the length of time to be able to draw those funds out. I think I want to note for the committee in terms of what you're going to hear from my colleagues around these programs, some of the themes you're going to hear around are entitlement funds and competitive funds. So the entitlement funds are they're formula or non-competitive funds, and they're based generally on a predetermined formula with authorizing legislation and regulations that define criteria and amounts. And then there are also competitive or discretionary grants that are awarded based on a competitive application review process. That's a majority of what we're going to talk about here today. There are some grants that are out there that are outside of MDE school districts, and other organizations can receive federal aid by applying for grant program funds directly as they are eligible and as spelled out by the opportunity.
Senator Barnsworth, you had a question?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I just want to make sure that I'm clear about that chart that you have on there. So the 90% Am I correct that that's 90% that was passed by Congress that can't be changed? There no executive order could pull that money back. It's only the 10% that would be the competitive grants that maybe an executive order could impact them. Is that correct, or am I misinterpreting something?
Madam Chair, Senator Farnsworth, my apologies. We probably could have labeled this a little bit more clearly. This is 10% is the federal funds that we receive in general. 90% represents the state funds that we allocate towards education. So this $1.4 billion in last year, $1.4 billion this year represents about 10% that the state spends on education.
Senator Farnsworth.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I guess my question moving forward, and I kind of sort of did a sneak peek at some of the slides that you have coming up. I'm just curious, my understanding is that most of the federal funds that we receive for education is passed by Congress and can't be impacted at all by executive order. So I'm wondering, as you're going through this presentation, if you could just delineate which of these funds can't change as a result of executive action and which of these funds can change, so that we really, I mean, I think it's important to know at what level the president can pull back these funds, because if it's passed by Congress and signed into law by the president, it seems like he can't at least permanently pull back these funds. So if you could, as you're doing the presentation, try and allow us to know how much of those funds really the executive has the ability to pull back, that would be very helpful.
Madam Chair, Senator Farnsworth, one of the things that we'll note in the presentation is what is entitlement based and then what is discretionary. I think we don't want to speculate too much in terms of what tangibly how it would work out could be framed as this would be impacted by this executive order or this would be impacted by this executive order. What I can say is that what I had pointed at earlier in terms of what a Department of Education would look like. A lot of these funds, regardless of whether they're entitlement or they're discretionary, do depend on systems in place that distribute the funds to states to be able, especially when they're entitlement funds that are passed by Congress and are overseen by regulations, that depend on the systems and the people in place who are experts, who have relationships with state-based employees who know how the programs work, know the students that they're working with. And so it's one of the things that we're trying to seek clarity around is not only what the authority is around and what funds can be, in your words, can be stopped or not stopped, but what maintains the smooth flow of the programs, the funds, and the information needed for monitoring, oversight, and allowing the funds to be released to states and then to our local districts to support our students and families.
Thank you, Mr. Dosh. And Senator McQuaid.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think as you go through, right now, an unelected billionaire and like college students have access to the Treasury Department and the Department of Education. And so whether the authority is there or not, or the ability legally, the actual ability to turn off funding has been seized by a billionaire. And so I'm really interested in knowing where these federal funds come, because I don't know if the law is going to matter if some other random billionaire has control of whether actual funds get to us. And so I do really want to hear, unless the funds don't come from the Department of Treasury or the Department of Education, maybe that would be a good place to note. But right now, I don't know if the EO's legality or not, whether Congress can do it or not, is going to matter that much.
You may continue, Mr. Dosh. Mr. Uni.
Madam Chair, committee members, one of the parts of the federal funds process is the review and approval process that does involve the legislature. In most cases, Minnesota statute requires the executive branch agencies, including the Department of Education, to receive legislative review before expending federal money. It does occur through several pathways. Legislative approval occurs through one of these 5 general buckets, and this is an MMB-led process, so if there are detailed questions in this, I'm happy to go back to MMB and be able to provide some information via that way. But the 5 ways are the governor's biennial budget, the revised recommended biennial budget, the session submission or governor's supplemental budget, the Legislative Advisory Commission fall 20-day review process for when the legislature is not in session, and then for urgent or as-needed situations, the Legislative Advisory 10-day review process. And with that, I will pass it to my colleague, Assistant Commissioner Mansfield.
Pause just for a minute. Senator Gustafson, you had a question.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. And I don't know if this is the right place because I'm not, if you're going into, okay, so you're going into some more federal funding here with the title funds. Maybe I'll hold my question then because it does have to do with funding on federal funds on other programs that are maybe outside the 10%. So I will listen and follow up. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. You may go ahead. Introduce yourself and begin.
Sounds great. Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Angela Mansfield. I'm Assistant Commissioner of the Department of Education here in Minnesota. Chairwoman and distinguished members of the committee, thank you so much for this opportunity to testify today regarding our title funding. I am specifically right now going to talk about the Elementary and Secondary Education Act and its implementation here in Minnesota. Specifically the title funding. This is going to be kind of a long stream, so feel free to interrupt me at any minute, any moment about individual funding. Next slide, sorry, Adosh. This foundational education legislation originally enacted in 1965 and most recently reauthorized in 2015 as Every Student Succeeds Act. This legislation remains the cornerstone of our federal education policy, establishing the framework through which we support academic achievement here for our Minnesota students. The Act operates through a comprehensive system of funding allocation and accountability measures. These measures track academic outcomes and progress using multiple assessment criteria to ensure Minnesota schools can effectively serve our students. The structure of ESEA consists of distinct programs designated as titles, each addressing specific educational priorities while maintaining alignment with the Act's overarching objectives of academic excellence and student achievement. Regarding fiscal implementation, Congress provides annual appropriations based on documented concentrations of poverty. Minnesota becomes eligible for these federal funds through our federally approved ESEA state plan, with allocations determined through U.S. Census Bureau Small Area Income and Poverty Estimates, or SAPE data, and equivalent metrics. For Minnesota's local education agencies, or LEAs, eligibility determination follows 2 distinct pathways. Traditional districts utilize SAPE data, while charter schools employ a specialized equivalency formula due to their unique organizational structure. Each title program implements specific formulaic calculations for both state reservations and LEA funding allocations. In our oversight capacity at MDE, we provide comprehensive support to eligible LEAs to ensure programmatic compliance and appropriate expenditure of funds. This includes the review and approval of annual work plans submitted by LEAs documenting their intended use of funds and expected outcomes. It is important to note that the Act's provisions extend to non-public education through equitable service requirements. Minnesota's LEAs provide these services to eligible students and staff in participating non-public schools within their jurisdictions. Finally, I would highlight that the ESEA title program formulas have proven sufficiently robust that Congress has frequently utilized these existing frameworks for the distribution of emergency education funds, such as demonstrated most recently with American Rescue Plan, and which have supported Minnesota schools through recent challenges during the COVID pandemic. Okay, our first title that we're going to go through is Title I implementation. And this one represents one of the most significant components of this legislation in Minnesota. This programming focuses specifically on strengthening academic performance in our schools. And for context, in Minnesota's current allocation for federal fiscal year '24 and state fiscal year '25, it stands close to 200 million, which is really substantial allocation for our students' academic success. This implementation occurs through our state's North Star accountability system, which we manage through the wonderful investment you all have put in our Compass statewide system of support. It aligns with our broader ESEA framework that I discussed previously and provides Minnesota-specific oversight and accountability measures. To illustrate the scope of this program in our state, we currently have 476 local education agencies actively participating in Title I programming. And these LEAs implement both required and optional district-wide activities. Additionally, specific schools within these districts receive targeted Title I support to enhance their programming that they're already doing across the district. And that would be programming that goes above and beyond their Tier 1 or their core instruction support that they're delivering to students. This structure complements the broader ESEA framework that I described, creating a comprehensive system of academic support across our entire state. Our state-level activities through Compass also provide the oversight and accountability measures necessary to ensure effective use of these federal funding resources. The strategic distribution of these funds, these Title I funds throughout Minnesota schools, enables the implementation of evidence-based practices and strengthened instructional programs directly supporting the broader ESEA objectives that were also outlined previously. So it takes the core instructional measures and brings it up another notch for our students. Next slide. All right.
Can I
Thank
just
you,
make a
I was
comment?
waiting. Yeah.
So would you explain Title I a little bit more clear? I mean, from what I understand, these are the dollars that are going to the high poverty areas of Minnesota communities, and specifically some of the schools that have the highest levels of poverty and the least resources available to them in their community. Is that what we're talking about here?
It would be, that's one way to put it, yes.
Okay.
And every 3 years, you have probably noticed that we have an identification process that comes through our North Star accountability system. And that would be our schools through the formula measures and how we look through MCA. It would be our schools that we've identified to receive this additional level of support through their test results, through other measures, which we can get, get to all of you, that we've agreed with the federal government through our state ESEA plan. So poverty would be, grad rate would be another measure, how they're performing on our state's assessment would be another measure. And then through Compass, through the dollars that we receive through Title I, those are the resources that we funnel out to those schools for additional support for the students.
And could you give us some examples of what those supports might look like?
I sure can,
Thank
yeah. So it could be additional professional development dollars. It could be attendance initiatives. It could be if their reading was a high problem or issue challenge point. It could be additional reading investment of curriculum or training or peer coaching or things like that for students. It depends on whatever their targeted area of support that what they were identified for. Then they create a plan around that and decide what are the evidence-based practices that they could use to support that improvement for their students.
Great, thank you. Senator McQuaid.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So does the calculation is that done, like the state submits data and then it's done through a formula, and then does the state get a set amount of money and then kind of push it out to districts or school, well, maybe, is it districts or is it schools or is it students? And then, or do they receive it directly from the federal government and then the state is a intermediary? I guess I'm just trying to understand like how, like I represent ISD 196. I went to Greenleaf Elementary. Is Greenleaf Elementary getting the money? Is ISD 196 getting the money? Are they getting it directly from the feds? Or are they getting it from the state?
Thank you, Madam
Ms.
Chair.
Corday.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair and Senator McQuaid. It comes through from the federal government to the state, and then we allocate it out to the districts for their schools. And so it would be, I believe, I think I'm going to have to get that information from you. I believe it's granted, oh, I thought you were giving me the answer. I believe it's granted out per pupil. But I want to make sure we give you the right information there.
Thank
So
you.
we'll follow up.
And Senator Gustafson.
So looking through, thank you, Madam Chair. And looking through your presentation and your slides, I don't see it. Maybe that's why I was waiting for my question, but maybe now is as good a time as any. Thinking about federal funding, wondering if we're going to bring up Minnesota Reading Corps or Math Corps at all in the federal funding that comes for those programs. Minnesota receives about $28 million in federal funding for these two programs. Last week, I believe we had several presentations on teacher shortages and how that was such an ongoing issue here in Minnesota. For those who don't know, Minnesota Reading Corps and Math Corps literally take teachers and help out other teachers in Minnesota to reduce those class sizes and help with those core issues of math and reading. And I know those scores come up quite a bit. So this is a federal program that directly addresses that particular need and concern that we have here in Minnesota, and Minnesota receiving $28 million in federal funding for these two programs, and an additional $9.7 million in education awards that they can use also for those teachers and their student loans. Will that be discussed in this presentation, and how are you going to make up the costs that we might lose in federal funding for those two programs?
Who would like to
yeah.
respond to that?
We're going to, Madam Chair, Senator Joseph said thanks for the question. I think Mr. Cordy has a little bit more detailed answer in terms of the flow of funds there. But what I will say is our presentation overall, put together kind of in a short period of time, does cover the major streams that come through the U.S. Department of Education, and then, of course, nutrition funding that comes to the USDA. So while we try to be as comprehensive as possible, it is not the full net across all of state or federal government in terms of the funds that come. Happy to come back and provide more information or provide information to the committee on any specific grants, but that is not included in this presentation specifically, but I know Mr. Cordy has a little bit more information.
Mr. Corday.
Madam Chair, members, Darren Cordy, Assistant Commissioner for the Office of Student Support Services at MDE. Yes, Senator Gustafson, Reading Corps and Math Corps are structured a little bit differently than some of the things that we're presenting here, since the funding for those programs comes from AmeriCorps and not from the U.S. Department of Education. There are organizations that apply for the ability to administer those funds at a state level. So in Minnesota, that organization is Serve Minnesota. Then we have another organization called Reading and Math Incorporated. They're the nonprofit organization that disseminates that funding. So it's kind of a little bit more of a multi-layered process, and again, not directly connected with the U.S. Department of Education, which is mainly the focus of the funding that we have in this presentation. But we appreciate the question.
Thank you. And follow-up?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate your answer. I guess the larger question then is, it's not just federal funding that we get from the U.S. Department of Education. There are a lot of other federal funding sources that come to Minnesota that would deeply impact if any of that funding is cut off. $28 million for reading and math is a big deal. We haven't even touched yet on the Department of Agriculture, which is what funds the National School Lunch Program, which is what funds a big chunk of our universal school meals. So if that goes away, we're now talking about Minnesota filling up a huge gap in funding there as well, as it is right now. Minnesota is the last dollar on universal school meals so that we can keep the costs low here in Minnesota. Losing all of that funding is going to impact families as well. So federal funding coming in from lots of different places, and when that's under threat, you're going to be seeing an impact on our local schools. And after last week's presentation on schools and the school superintendents who came in to visit us, even 10% is going to be devastating to our schools. So I don't want to downplay only 10% when we have 90% of our, we depend on that 10%. They're in here begging for a 1% increase in formula. We can't talk about eliminating 10% of what they might be getting. So I just want to keep that in mind as dollars are being talked about, and interested in the rest of the conversation on federal funding.
Mr. Uni.
Madam Chair, I think Senator Gustafson does bring up a good point. One that I want to hone in on is one that I covered in my opening remarks. We did try to cast as wide a net as we could in terms of what we were able to cover in the presentation, but I think this does speak to what is the full net? Where is the clarity around what is being contemplated right now, especially as it pertains to the federal level? We are, as everyone here is, all decision makers here are grappling with what is that? What is the full scope of this? And we're going to try the best we can to be able to answer the question, provide the information here, but we are also grappling with that question of what is the extent to which these questions go, and which communities, which students, which schools could be impacted by some of these questions that come up today.
Thank you. And then Senator Maquaid, and then we'll go back to the presentation.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I think I really appreciate Senator Gustafson bringing that up, because that's what, $350 million we identified in 1 minute that we're not talking about here. So I'm like, oh my gosh, what's not here? But I think what would really be helpful as you go forward, so you can answer it about this specifically, but the rest of them, is when do we get that funding? So when do we apply, and then when does it come in? Is it on a rolling basis? Is it on a fiscal year, so it's like in June? Is it before a school year? And maybe they're all different, but it would be really helpful to know when that money comes in, and when it goes out to schools as well.
Yep, that would be very helpful. And I know I said we were going to jump back in, but I'm going to give the new guy an opportunity, Senator Clark.
Thanks, Chair Kunish, and if I get the questions wrong in the process, please help me along the way. I think perhaps for future pieces, presenters, one thing I'm looking for in here is, okay, I see $193 million. How many jobs is that? How many jobs are we just going that this goes away? And if I'm someone going, all right, I'm uncertain if the funds are coming, why would I even post the job? So I think schools are craving stability, and this is going to affect jobs. I don't know how many jobs this is, so if this is something that we could get as future information as well. And I think the unknowable is, why would I even bother to post? So how many jobs are never even going to get posted, because I don't know if I can trust the word of the federal government anymore. Thank you.
And you may continue.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Madam Chair.
Thank you for your patience.
Yeah, no worries. Yes, next slide. All right. I will address the timing. These are federal fiscal years, which, as you know, is different than our state fiscal year. And also, they are all based on a reimbursement mechanism. So our LEAs submit their reimbursement to our grants department, and then we reimburse based on what we receive from them. We also then have to submit for reimbursement to the federal government.
Senator Maquaid.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We're all learning finance.
Yes.
So to be clear, so districts already spend the money and then submit reimbursement to the state, and the state already spends the money and then submits reimbursement to the federal government. So right now, today, has there been money spent by districts and or the state that reimbursements would be submitted for that could potentially not be reimbursed?
Madam Chair and Senator Mayquade, yes, that would be the correct understanding.
And follow up?
Thank you, Madam Chair. What would that amount be?
Mr. Uni.
Madam Chair, Senator Mayquade, I don't have the information now of what the draws have been, and to be clear, we have access to the federal funds, and it really is based at what the impact is at the local level. So we have the access to the funds. The federal government does review the funds for their standard program and oversight and monitoring to make sure that what is submitted to the state aligns with what the formula is based on the expertise that those specific staff members have gained over the years, based on the collaboration they have between different divisions. In terms of what the specific draws are, we'd have to go back to our agency finance team and our federal funds team to be able to get those numbers in terms of what they've drawn already and what, based on prior years, are projected draws to yet come based on what the allocations would be for under those entitlement programs.
Senator McQuaid, follow up?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. So you said that the federal government, is it the Department of Education, reviews that the formula is appropriate for what is being reimbursed for. If the Department of Education has been purged and there's college students running it through AI and they've decided that we're no longer going to reimburse for schools, who are supporting Black History Month, would we then just not, we would be out that money because the district's already spent it and the state has already spent it. And if the federal government says, just kidding, we don't want to reimburse for that, that's something that could happen?
Mr. Uni?
Madam Chair, Senator Mayquaid, in terms of the validation, oversight, and monitoring that is required by the federal government for the funds that we have to make sure that they align with the formula set out under regulations, that leaves a lot of questions in terms of how long that would take, the expertise in terms of who is doing that monitoring and oversight, and what would hold up any type of validation of the reimbursements that we said were in line with the formulas that were laid out in statute. You bring up an interesting question in terms of access to information. There is a lot of personal information that drive a lot of these formulas and identifiable student information. But in terms of how the funding flows, whether there will be any delays or what extra questions may be asked, that's a question that we're grappling with. We do have a lack of clarity in terms of the information that we're getting from the current federal department, in terms of what that will look like, in terms of what a few months out look like. So you ask really good questions, Senator. And these are questions that we're going to have to ask ourselves. You may have some questions that we need to start asking about this, because together we are all kind of finding out day to day what the situation looks like.
Senator McQuaid?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And you don't have to answer this right now, maybe as you go through, but the piece about the information on students is really concerning. I mean, the information getting out to security clearance people in the Department of Treasury was concerning enough, but now the Department of Education, they've confirmed that security clearance people have access to the information. And so I guess it didn't occur to me until right now that you said that there's a lot of identifiable information on students that is at the Department of Education because of this reimbursement. Is that right?
Mr. Uni or Ms. Mansfield?
Madam Chair, Senator, yes, that's correct. But we're grappling with kind of to what scope that is in what programs. We're seeing the same information as a lot of here, so we're trying to fully understand what the scope is. Because I don't have a lot of information, there's just a lot of people to consult on that. I don't have a whole lot to say on that space. It's just, it was a good question. It's something to consider in the context of how is information handled to be able to validate through the normal standard monitoring and program oversight to be able to validate the payments that come to the state and then go out to districts. And that goes to the smooth flow of operations to make sure that our schools have the funds they need to be able to operationalize these programs for our students that need it the most. And that Ms. Mansfield has talked about. You're going to hear from Mr. Cordy as well.
Thank you. Senator Farnsworth.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As I listen to this, Mr. Uni, you early in your testimony said, that you don't, I can't remember the word, don't want to guess what's going to happen, but that's basically what we're doing. The federal government might cut some funds. The federal government might cut all funds. They might cut no funds. We have absolutely no idea what's going to happen. But what we know is that our schools have been crushed over the last 2 years by what this body has done. Everyone that testified has said all of the mandates are absolutely crushing us. And this hearing is just an attempt to distract from the fact that everything this legislature touched in education last year turned to crap. Our schools, Anoka is cutting, 200 and some schools because of what we did, not because of what maybe the federal government is going to do or not going to do. And we can say, well, an unelected billionaire is making these decisions. We have unelected people. Mr. Uni is unelected. Commissioner Jett is unelected. We have a lot of unelected people that make decisions, so that has no bearing on this conversation. This conversation should be, what did we do to screw up our schools and what are we going to do to fix it, irregardless of what the federal government is going to do. This is just a distraction because at some point somebody wants to say, well, our schools are struggling, but it's not our fault. It's the orange man. It's the guy in Washington, D.C. that's screwing up our education, and it was us. And our superintendents and our school board members told us that it was this body, and this is just a distraction. And I apologize to you three, you're kind of caught in the middle of a political debate here, and it's probably uncomfortable for you. But we don't need to be distracted. We need to come up with real solutions, and when we have real data on what's happening at the federal level, then we can figure it out. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess this is for the department as a whole, and as I've sat here and listened to the myriad of federal funding formulas and how you've gone through from top to bottom, and jumping on Senator Gussum's bandwagon, 10% of the budget is a big chunk. I have no doubt on board with that line of thinking. I've been reading through the executive order, and here's the deal: is the federal funding comes with strings attached, right? It comes with strings attached, which is ironic because everything we sent out of here last year came with strings attached. These strings seem to be, for some reason or another, not the strings we want, right? Is that, and the question for you, I think, is, does the department or the chairman of the committee here intend on not following through with the strings? Is that what we're talking about? Are we not going to comply with the federal government's requirements, and that's why we're talking about missing out on the 10%? Or is there talk behind the scenes that, hey, we maybe have to comply with these federal strings to get the 10%? I mean, that seems like what we're talking about. We've never really bridged the gap of whether or not the department can just say, we're going to comply with Section 3 of the order and get our 10%. Because it seems as of right now that we just talk about cutting the federal funding, not about complying with what they're asking.
Go ahead.
Madam Chair, committee members, the Department of Education, Minnesota Department of Education, local education entities, all entities that receive funds from the federal government and our state law have to comply with the rules and regulations that are laid out in federal law. One thing that I had mentioned in my testimony and some of my comments is there is a lot of lack of clarity of what is being required by some of the recent events over the last few weeks, and that's one of the things that we're grappling with, of just understanding what the scope and nature of it. One of the components that it is creating a wait and see and a lot of unknowns is some of the executive orders, and I can't speak to what the exact substance means because that's one of the things, what does it mean, what we're grappling with. But one of the components is that it does ask the secretary of every agency to come up with plans that are 60, 90, 120 days out. And so there is a wait and see, and that creates a lot more of what does this mean? So in terms of what does the substance mean of any particular executive order, we have to delve into it when we get more information. And so I think a lot of your questions, I can't necessarily speak to those specifically because we just don't have a lot of the information of what that looks like. What we can speak to here in this presentation is the specific funding streams, what it means for students, what it means for schools as they currently sit. Right now we're left with questions just about what this means, but we're going to continue to operate the programs as we can, as we are, as we have been, to the best of our ability.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So just to clarify, you have no intention on following the strings of what are attached to this executive order, right? Or am I wrong in assuming that's what you just said?
Mr. Rooney.
Madam Chair, Senator Lang, I didn't speak to intention. When we're trying to
Okay.
understand, I mean, one of the components of federal law executive orders is fully understanding and having the clarity, having the guidance of how to follow them. And one of the things that I did mention is that there are requirements in the executive orders around the agencies will come up with state plans about how to execute them in 60, 90, 120 days. So we need to understand what is required of states to be able to comply with these executive orders that continue to be operative.
And not to cut you off, thank you, Madam Chair, but you are bound to comply with federal law. Did I catch that right?
Yeah, Madam Chair, Senator Lang, what I stated at the beginning is that all the federal funds that are out there are governed by regulations. There are program oversight, monitoring, and checks and balances at the federal government that have requirements, that have people there that make us
Sure.
comply with federal law.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Would I be wrong in saying that the Minnesota Department of Education will comply with federal law if that federal law is brought out, right? So what I'm trying to get at is the 10% of the budget that we've been discussing today really at jeopardy, or are we just talking about we're upset with the fact that we don't like the strings that are attached to it? Is it really in jeopardy? Do you have to follow federal statute?
So Senator Lang, this, what we're talking about here today is helping all of us wrap our head around where the funding from the federal government is going to impact our decision and how we are going to budget. This is not a discussion, I mean, we can ask these questions, or maybe you want to set up a meeting with MDE around their plans to comply. And as an elected official, myself and the chair of this committee, I also will comply with federal regulations when it comes to addressing the needs of our students. And so, right now, trying to nail down the Department of Education on whether they're going to comply or not is not really part of this discussion, but you can always have that conversation later. We have 40 or 30 some more slides to get through, and so I'm going to ask members to limit your questions for a while until we get a little bit more into this and we can understand better just where we're going and how we are going to fund our schools should the funding mechanism either get turned off or are redirected in a way that we have to figure that out.
Sure. No, thank you, Madam Chair, and I didn't mean to get you off the rails by any means. I just want to make sure that we're, spending our time wisely. Like if federal funding is going to be cut, or if we're not going to comply with what the feds are saying, then that's one thing. If we're really going to be missing out on this 10%, then here we are. We need to talk about that. We need to adjust for it, sure.
Sure, and if we don't get through
Yeah.
today, we can do this on Wednesday. Yep, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I guess I would like to be able to get through these slides to get that understanding of what the federal money is, but what I've heard starting is panic about what might happen. And I think Senator Lang is trying to get at this idea of let's get an understanding before we panic. Because if we follow along with the guidelines, there really shouldn't be anything that's in jeopardy. We had a number of superintendents over the last couple of years coming and testifying. I didn't hear any panic in their voices. What I heard is they're asking for help So let's set a good example for our schools and for our kids. Let's not panic. Let's get this information. Let's get understanding of what is coming at us, and then we'll deal with it. Let's not panic before we have any clue as to what it is. Let's dig into it and know what we're talking about before we're filled with worry.
Thank you. Thank you so much. All right, if you would like to continue.
All right, thank you so much, Madam Chair and committee members. We're going to move on to Title I, Part C, and this is our state's implementation of the Migrant Education Program. This program serves students who travel with their families across state lines for agricultural work, including farming and food processing operations. For our federal fiscal 24 and state fiscal 25, Minnesota has been allocated almost $1.5 million for migrant education services. These funds support 8 local education agencies across our state that provide targeted academic support services for migratory students. These programs ensure that despite the interruptions to their education due to necessary agricultural moves, these students can maintain academic progress and work towards graduation. Just so you know, there are about 1,500 students with this status in our state currently, and I think, yeah, that's it. We can go to the next slide. Title I-D is our prevention and intervention programs for youth in neglected, delinquent, or at-risk situations. This program focuses specifically on dropout prevention and educational continuity for these students. You'll see the allocation there, just a little under $1 million. These funds support 19 local education agencies across our states that coordinate essential educational programming between their districts and juvenile detention facilities, as well as other identified sites serving youth within district boundaries. This coordinated approach ensures educational services continued uninterrupted for students in these facilities and maintain their academic progress regardless of their temporary placement. Title II-A. This focuses on supporting effective instruction across our state. There's a larger sum there, about $26.5 million for this initiative, and it engages 504 of our district's LEAs throughout Minnesota. They use the funds for 3 primary purposes: professional development for educators, strategic recruitment and retention efforts, which is really important right now in Minnesota, and then class size reduction initiatives. Each of those elements contribute to strengthening our academic instruction in our schools. It is worth noting that 176 of our LEAs have exercised the flexibility option that's provided under this to transfer those funds to other authorized programs, which allows them to align resources within their specific local needs. We can, if you're interested, we can also provide more information, detailed information about those transfers later. Title III-A, which works in concert with our Minnesota statutes, sections 124D, 58 through 65, to support English learners in our state. This federal program supplements that state mandated English learning programs to help students attain English proficiency while also meeting Minnesota's academic standards. A little over $11 million. These funds currently support 134 local education agencies and consortia throughout our states. They implement these resources through 3 primary channels: professional development, comprehensive language instruction and educational programs, and strategic family and community engagement activities. Each of those components play a very essential role in supporting academic achievement for English learners in our schools. Title IV-A. This is the Student Support and Academic Enrichment Program. And this expands student support through 3 key focus areas. The first is well-rounded education, which includes support for programs in areas such as STEM, the arts, music, foreign language, AP, advanced placement, and college career counseling. The second would be safe and healthy learning environments, which could encompass school safety programs, mental health services, addressing bullying and harassment. And the third area supports the effective use of technology to improve academic achievement and digital literacy. It is just under, over 13.7 million for this initiative, supporting 467 LEAs across the state. And this also allows them to choose to direct those resources to other ESEA programs, and we currently have 269 LEAs who are taking that opportunities, and we can also get you more information if you're interested there. Title IV-B is our 21st Century Community Learning Centers, and these centers provide vital and academic enrichment opportunities during non-school hours for students attending high-poverty, low-performing schools. We have 13.2 million for this initiative, and at the state level, these funds support comprehensive program oversight, including monitoring, evaluation training, professional development, and the administration of competitive grant processes. What distinguishes this program is its broad range of eligible entities. Currently, we have 21 recipients comprising 14 LEAs and 7 community-based organizations. I think that's a really nice blend that represents the range of the entitlement. These organizations implement 3 core components: academic support in subjects such as reading and math, enrichment activities that complement regular academic programs, and educational services for families of the participating students. The impact of this program is very significant. During the 23-24 school year, our funded organization reached 16,420 students, 6,626 family members across Minnesota, demonstrating the program's effectiveness in supporting both student achievement and family engagement. Okay. Title V-B is our rural and low-income school program, providing supplemental funding to rural low-income schools to support ESEA-allowed activities. About $151,000 for this initiative, supporting 5 LEAs in implementing various activities that are permitted. It is important to note that this program operates alongside the Rural Education Achievement Program Small Rural Achievement Grant, known as REAP SRSA, which is managed directly by the U.S. Department of Education. Currently, 173 Minnesota LEAs participate in that sister program.
Senator Rourke, you have a question?
Yep. Thank you, Madam Chair. So the money for that program does not flow through MDE? That would go directly to the schools from the federal agency, or what is the difference there between the two, how they operate?
Ms. Mansfield.
Madam Chair, Senator Rourke, for the sister program, is that what you're asking? That also does flow through MDE. It's just a separate allotment.
Follow-up?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Then do you know the dollar amount for that program? Is the 151 just for the 5 schools, so then do we know the dollar amount for the 173?
We can follow, oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Ms. Mansfield, go
I'm so
ahead.
sorry.
No worries.
Madam Chair, Senator Rourke, we can follow up with that information for you.
And then Senator McQuaid.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I apologize if the answer is that all the title funds are working the same way. The districts pay, and then they get reimbursed from the state pays and gets reimbursed from the federal government. So that's the same for this as well, for all these title funds.
Madam,
Ms. Mansfield.
I will get it right, I promise.
No worries.
Madam Chair, Senator McQuaid, yes, that is correct.
I just have a real quick, follow-up?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And is it a rolling basis that we're getting this, or do districts do it in the middle of the year, the beginning of the year, the end of the year? I'm just trying to understand, like, I represent the third largest district in the state, and so I'm wondering, like, at what point will my district know that they're out of money and that it's not getting reimbursed?
Ms. Mansfield.
Madam Chair, Senator McQuaid, it is really a rolling basis, and there's really good communication between the districts and our authorized rep and the grants team. So I haven't seen a situation where there's worry like that. There's really good communication between the teams.
Thank you. I do have one quick question. I noticed that the bulk of this goes to supplies and materials. What are we talking about when we're talking about supplies and materials?
For this
Yep.
allocation specifically, I would have to get more, I'm sorry, Madam Chair, I would have to get more information on that to
Okay.
you. I would guess, and I don't know, hold 1 second. Yeah, my notes have any allowable use in any other program, so I would have to get more information from my team for you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
All right, you may continue.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. We are on Indian, yeah. All right, we are on our Indian Education Formula grants. It's important to note on this one that eligibility for this program is based on the federal designation of American Indian students, which differs from Minnesota state designation. It has inclusion of mixed race. 2 or more races, excuse me, I'm sorry. The program serves American Indian students through partnerships with our LEAs, tribally controlled schools, tribes, Indian organizations, and Indian community-based organizations. For fiscal year '24, this award, the program has been awarded $5 million, a little over $5 million, to 91 grantees across Minnesota, serving 17,631 American Indian students. Unlike under other ESEA programs we've discussed, grantees apply directly to the U.S. Department of Education for these funds. So this one is a little bit different. The program includes several essential requirements to ensure meaningful tribal consultation and community engagement. Each grantee must establish and receive approval from an American Indian Parent Advisory Committee, APAC. They must also conduct open consultation with parents, teachers, and tribes, and share assessment results with both the Parent Advisory Committee and the broader community. Additionally, grantees must engage in meaningful collaboration with tribes within a 50-mile radius and implement Indian hiring preferences and training opportunities. These requirements ensure strong community involvement in program implementation. The funds support comprehensive program design to address the unique cultural, language, and educational needs of American Indian students while also ensuring they meet state academic standards. All right, our education for homeless children and youth. For this final section for my presentation, we are talking about a competitive grant program that ensures students experiencing homelessness have access to appropriate public education. For federal fiscal year '24 and state '25, Minnesota has received an allocation of just over $1 million for this initiative. These funds currently support 22 LEAs across our state in their work to remove barriers to enrollment attendance, and academic success for students experiencing homelessness. At this point, without any further questions, I'm going to turn my microphone over to my colleague, Darren Corti, for his part of the presentation.
Thank you, Ms. Mansfield, for all your information and appreciate you being here today. Senator Corte, Mr. Corte, if you'd like to begin, introduce yourself.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members. My name is Darren Cordy, again, Assistant Commissioner for the Office of Student Support Services at MDE. One of the areas I'll be talking about today is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. There's a number of different components under that overall federal legislation, which includes the different funds that you can see listed here that we'll be going through. So we'll start with IDEA Part B 611. This is by far the largest pot of federal special education funding that the state receives. This is a formula grant, which is intended to provide for paying a portion of the excess costs that come along with special education and related services. What we say when we mean excess cost is the cost of educating students with disabilities that is above and beyond what the cost would be to educate their non-disabled peers. So above and beyond, your general education formula, compensatory, et cetera. All states under this legislation must serve all children with disabilities between ages 3 through 21. This is under Part B. We'll talk about birth to age 3, which is under a different portion in a bit here. But again, that is a requirement that comes along with this funding. And when we say serve, as a reminder, each LEA in the state is required to provide students with disabilities with what's called a free and appropriate public education, or FAPE. In order to do so, they're required to create an individualized education program which outlines the services that student needs in order to access FAPE. And so this funding is intended to help pay for a portion of those services.
May I just ask
please.
a quick question? So in essence, as Senator Rarick points out, this is our cross subsidy, right? What we're talking about is when we are trying to make up the difference from the federal government around some of these cross subsidies, is this where that funding, is that the base of the funding that we talk about when it comes to cross subsidy?
Madam Chair, that's correct. So when IDEA was originally passed, there was a commitment from the federal government to pay about 30% of the excess costs of providing services, with the states being expected to, or local municipalities expected to pick up the rest. Currently, I don't have the most recent numbers, but I know it's usually around 7 to 8% is what the federal government picks up. State picks up around 70 to 80%. That's gone up in recent years as a result of the decision to help try and buy down some of that cross subsidy. But yes, the longer explanation of your question, yes, the lack of full federal funding here has contributed to the need of districts to tap into some of their general education revenue to cover the cost of these services. As you can see, this is a formula-based amount. It's a little wonky in that it's based on your 1998 resident child count. If there's new, opened, or expanded schools since then they're reallocated based on the current year child count. And then the remaining flow-through is allocated at 85% of enrollment, with 15% being based on free and reduced price lunch counts, which can either be accomplished through families who complete the forms or those who are directly certified for those meals through other means. These are considered entitlements to the LEA, and they are accessed through the grant system, so maybe a little bit different than what we were talking about earlier. The state receives a large pot of federal funding here, and then districts draw down from those on a cost reimbursement-based system. I think another thing to point out with this as well, too, is I think others have asked about strings attached. I think if the federal funding for this were to be paused or eliminated, we would have to ask the question of whether or not the mandate to continue to provide services would continue. So if that mandate were to exist to continue to provide services, then the state would have to, step in and fill the gap of lost federal funding like they have in the past, and we just talked about with the cross subsidy.
Senator Gustafson, did you have a question? Yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Is this the right moment to ask you about CEP? Or would that be in the next section under nutrition?
Madam Chair, Senator Gustafson, yes, I think as we're talking about school meals, perhaps that might be the better time we talk about nutrition, but if I get past that and haven't covered what you'd like, please let me know.
I didn't catch that, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, I was just, Madam Chair, I'm sorry, and Senator Gustafson, I was just saying, if I get through my nutrition slides and I still haven't answered your question, please let me know.
Very good, thank you.
You may continue.
We'll move on to the next section, which is another part of IDEA Part B, this one labeled 619. These are all just references to the federal code that these fall under. These are for preschool grants for children to receive special education and related services for ages 3 through 5. Once again, this is a federal mandate, as well as we have other state requirements that require providing services for children 3 to age 5 to be able to access a free and appropriate public education. You'll see this pot is significantly smaller, mostly because it's serving a much smaller set of students with your age 3 to age 5, whereas the other pot goes all the way up to age 22 here in Minnesota. This, again, is a formula-based appropriation, which school districts and charter schools will submit reimbursement to MDE based on a cost basis. So after they've incurred the cost of providing services, they submit to MDE in order to get reimbursed for those, as the other pot as well. These are considered entitlements and not competitive grants, to which the state could conceivably say, no, you're not entitled to these.
Thank you. Senator Rarick, you have a question.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. So when I see in here that it's allocated based on the 96 resident child count, is that something that's coming from the federal, that it's based on that count, or is that something that we should potentially be looking at and adjusting?
Madam Chair and Senator Rarick, it's based upon the enacting of legislation from Congress. I'm not sure why 1996 is the operative year there. I think it probably has something to do with the last time the IDEA was reauthorized, which it's been a number of years. But as you can see, that's only for that initial 5.3 million. The remainder of the funding is based on current year enrollment counts for 85%, and then the remaining 15% based on free and reduced price lunch counts.
Good to know. Thank you. Senator McQuaid.
Thank you, and I apologize, I think this was on the previous slide. It was about the CEDRA, and the budgets are loaded from CEDRA to MEGS weekly. Can you just explain that one more time?
Mr. Corday.
Sure, Madam Chair, Senator McQuaid. Yes, so the state receives their allocation typically around the summertime for the expected costs of special education services to be paid by the federal government. Our system in which schools report that information to us, and then is called CEDRA, the Special Education Data Reporting System. And then the funds are sent out through our payment program, which is called MEGS. I don't know what that stands for, maybe somebody else does. But in the alphabet soup, there's just a long way of saying that we receive a large pot of money from the federal government, and then that's drawn down on a weekly basis by LEAs based on the services that were provided.
Senator McQuaid.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And this state gets this allocation, you said, in the summertime. Can you do when in the summer?
Go ahead.
Madam Chair and Senator McQuaid, I can get that information for you. I know it's typically around the beginning of our state fiscal years when we try and get it, so July 1st, but it may come earlier than that. I can get that information for you.
Yep, thank you, Madam Chair. And is there, so, it's February, at what point between now and July 1st do you have an idea of how much that pot is, or is July 1st or whenever it comes in the summer like, oh, here's how much it is, or do you know already?
Mr.
Sure.
Corday.
Yep, Madam Chair and Senator McQuaid. So the amount is fixed based on what the federal allocation is. What differs is how it's sent out to LEAs. So that $8 million, it varies from year to year based on, what the federal appropriation is. But that is fixed in legislation. That is not something that, as we talked about with the cross subsidy, if we're to exceed what the costs are, with the federal payment, then the state has to pick up the difference. If the state doesn't cover it, then the local district has to pick up the difference.
And just for kind of thinking about the data that we share about our students, is the data on these IDEA or the different parts, does the state have to send the student information to the federal government in order to access these dollars?
Madam Chair, that's a great question. So we definitely collect student data on the various categorical disability areas that a student might fall into, and that's definitely submitted to the federal government. We also have a number of performance measures where we have to show academic student performance for students with disabilities, also with other demographic data that's tied to that. What I don't know is if that data, when it's submitted to the federal government, is identifiable at a student level, or if it's just sent to the federal government in the aggregate as summary data. So that I would have to look into for you.
Appreciate that.
Okay.
Senator Clark, you had a question?
Thank you. So right now at my other job, it's budget season, and we're putting together all sorts of contingency budgets. How many contingency budgets do you think our schools are putting together based on this? If you have a CFO and a financial staff worth any salt, they're going, this is the plan, this is the uncertainty panel. And I know I heard my colleagues say, well, maybe we're not certain yet, or we are certain, or let's not worry about it. But if the CFO is making a budget, how many versions of the budget are they now making based on what is happening here? Thank you.
Mr. Corte.
Sure. Madam Chair and Senator Clark, I think that's a great question. It might be better answered from one of our education organization partners, but generally I know there are many contingencies, one of which, is what this body and what the legislature is going to act upon for next school year, but certainly the federal government. I will say for this, schools do a pretty good job trying to estimate what their special education costs are going to be moving forward. But that's just what it is it's always an estimate. If you have a student who moves into the district, say it's a small district, you have a student who moves into the district that has some really profound needs that requires a significant amount of special education services, that can really throw off whatever that budget estimate is. It's something that we hear about quite often. So, despite their best efforts and the talented folks that we have in schools, it can sometimes be a challenge on the special education front to try and guess, years in advance how much it's going to cost.
Follow up, and Madam Chair and Presenter, I know that it varies by year, but maybe it's simpler because this might just be a delete all budget on this topic.
Let's hope not. Senator McQuaid.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For the way that the state gets this money from the federal government, obviously, these are formulas that are reviewed if people still are employed at the Department of Education or administered by the Department of Education, but the literal receipt of payment, does that come from the U.S. Department of Treasury? Does it come from the payments, the secure payment system, SPS, or I think there's another one, the payment benefit system? Does it come from one of those two?
Are you able to answer that one?
Madam Chair, Senator McQuaid, that may be something I look to Senator Uni for. We may have to check in with our, sorry, Mr. Uni.
Congratulations on your
Not yet.
promotion.
But that may be a question we have to defer to our friends at MMB about, since the funds actually flow to MMB and then to MDE through them.
Thank you. All right, you may continue.
Okay, moving on to, we're going to go to the next slide in part 619. We can go to the next one. So just, these are, there's a sub-grant formula allocation as we talked about here. I think this kind of gets to a little bit about what Senator McQuaid was asking about, just in terms of the payment, that those expenditures are entered into CEDRA and then we pay those out weekly, so I think we've covered this slide for the most part. We can move on to Part C, which is the provision of services for birth through age 3. Each state kind of does this differently. Minnesota is what we call a birth mandate state. This is something we're pretty proud of, where we provide services right from the moment a child is born, if they're needed, and if they're determined to be at risk of being identified as a child with a disability. This is funded from the federal government to the tune of about $9 million. This is also done through a coordinated, comprehensive, multidisciplinary interagency program where we work closely with our partners at the Department of Human Services, since a lot of these services are not provided in a school setting. They may be provided in the home or in a child care setting. Once again, states are required for provision of these services regardless of what the federal funding is. So to the extent that the federal funding doesn't cover the full cost of services, either the state or the local education agency would be required to pick up the cost of those services. The difference between Part C and Part B being mainly that under Part B, you have to be a student who's identified with a disability in order to receive services under Part C. You don't have to be identified, but if a student can be identified as being at risk for developing a disability, then they can receive services that can be paid under this as well.
Senator McQuaid, you had a question?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Does the state have to identify the student as at risk, or does the federal government have to certify that that is true? So are we transmitting that data to the federal government?
Mr. Corte?
Sure, Madam Chair, Senator McQuaid. So the state, mainly through rulemaking in the past, has determined what the criteria is for identification. Then the LEAs are the ones who actually do the identification. If there are criteria, or the federal government does check to ensure that the state's criteria is in alignment with IDEA, but there is flexibility that's given to the states to determine what their own eligibility criteria would be. So, long way of saying that there are parameters and guidelines, but we have some flexibility in determining what those eligibility criteria would be within those guidelines.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just to, I guess my question specifically is, earlier in our presentation, Mr. Uni shared that there's identifiable student information that goes to the federal government under these title funds. Is that also true for IDEA? Are we sending identifiable student information to the federal government on students with disabilities or potential disabilities?
Madam Chair and Senator McQuaid, I think that's something I would need to check on. As I said earlier, I know that we submit data to the federal government about the number of students who are identified with in the different categorical areas, in this area also being just at risk. What I don't know is if that's individually identifiable at the federal level. It certainly is as it's submitted to us at MDE. I just don't know if that translates going up to the federal government.
Thank you.
Okay, the next piece is a grant program under IDEA, which is the State Personnel Development Grant. I think we've all heard from our counterparts in our districts about how challenging it is to recruit and retain our special education workforce. So this is a grant program which helps assist states in providing or districts in providing professional development, family engagement, implementation of effective practices. The state chooses what its goal is going to be for these grants. For Minnesota, for the 2020 to 2025 grant cycle, Minnesota has focused on improving graduation rates for American Indian and Black students. The reason being that for those students, those tend to be those with the lowest graduation rates, that is students with disabilities who are also American Indian and Black. This is some of the funding goes to pay for school mentoring programs, family engagement, and the addition and representation of American Indian teachers and administrators in the special education workforce. That funding is a little over $1 million each fiscal year. Just a little bit more on that grant. There are currently 9 school districts that are subgrantees for this grant. Sorry, I don't have it on the slide, but it is Minneapolis, St. Paul, Osseo, Bagley, Red Lake, Redwood, Duluth, Cloquet, Deer River, and the Nashig Tribal School. Another subgrantee that we work with is the Pacer Center, which, if you're not familiar, is a nonprofit organization, special education advocacy organization that provides engagement for, what they do under this grant, I should say, is providing engagement for American Indian families with disabilities and developing resources for them to better understand the complex special education system that we all work in. And then lastly, the Fond du Lac Tribal and Community College receives funds under this grant for developing improved systems for recruiting and retaining American Indian students into their teacher program and then retaining current teachers in the special education workforce. And then the last piece will, oh, I'm sorry.
I think Senator Clark has a question.
Chair Kunitz and presenter, on 25, it says this focuses on improving graduation rates for American Indian and Black students. Would that fall afoul of the DEIA cancellation? So we don't want to improve those graduation rates anymore?
Mr. Clark.
Sure.
Corday.
Madam Chair and Senator Clark, we have not heard anything from the Office of Special Education Programs at the Department of Education about the impacts of the executive orders on this particular goal area at this point.
Okay.
Thank you. Ooh, continue.
Okay, our last slide on the IDEA funds is the Minnesota Deaf Blind Project. Kind of a smaller pot of money in terms of the total amount, but very impactful for the number of students, which is a pretty small number. I think we had about 124 students categorized as deafblind last year. But the use of these funds is to provide technical assistance, which can take the form of family support, resource sharing, workshops, and mentoring for students who have a combined hearing and vision loss at any point from their birth through age 22. Anybody that's experiencing those disabilities or their family members or educators can request services, and then they're provided under this grant at no cost. Another thing I would note here too is that we work with a community partner called Brightworks as a partner on this project. So if there's nothing further on IDA, I'll move on to nutrition.
All right, if I could just take a moment to recognize the audience right now. If you look out at the audience, our room is full, and it is full of school counselors. And so please, everybody, wave and say hello. I just want to say thank you so very much for not only being here today. I hope you're listening carefully, because there could be, trickle-down effects of what's going on at the federal government in the work that you all do. And I think we just heard about our students with disabilities, our students that have the lowest academic success and graduation rates. I'm sure you're working with all of those students. And we also heard and are always reminded about the need for more school counselors and those kind of support people in our schools. It is a great concern of mine that those funds, the additional funds that we receive from the federal government, to make sure that we can not only keep all of you in your jobs, but also recruit, educate, and retain. And so I want to say thank you so much for the work that you do. It is not an easy job. But here you are to advocate for your students, not just at your schools, but here. Happy to see you here. Thank you.
All
so,
right.
Mr. Corday, if you are all powered up again.
Yes, I am.
You may begin.
That was good timing. Thank you, Madam Chair. We'll move on to the nutrition funds that the state receives. As mentioned, I think earlier, these are a little bit different in that they are funds that we receive from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, not the U.S. Department of Education. The purpose of these programs is to provide healthy and nutritious meals to children, and then providing nutrition education to children as well. Federal funds in 2024 totaled $431 million, the vast majority of which went to schools and sponsors, with a smaller slice staying for administration costs. That's both at the state and local level. We have about 900 sponsors that cover more than 8,000 sites in Minnesota, And those are under the three main programs that are operated, which is the school nutrition program, that's the National School Lunch Program and School Breakfast Program that we're all probably the most familiar with. And then the Child and Adult Care Food Program, which is a program which can serve meals in child care settings as well as at-risk after-school settings. And then the Summer Food Program, where food sites can operate in areas that are designated as high poverty by the federal government. And to the next slide, just kind of talking about how it's operationalized. Sponsors claim their meals monthly and are reimbursed on a per meal basis. And then Minnesota reimburses the claim and draws down funding from USDA. The sponsors submit their number of reimbursable meals each month. However, we do pay that out within 1 week, which is something we're pretty proud of. Some states don't have as quick of a turnaround on that. The reimbursement rates are set by USDA, and they vary by program and meal type and category of the student being free, reduced, or paid. The number of the schools estimate the number of meals that they'll serve each year in order to create a budget. So this is kind of similar to what we talked about under special education, where they have an estimate that covers or estimates the amount that they're going to need to cover what they need throughout the year, and then they'll true that up at the end of the year through their reimbursement process. As noted here, the reimbursement rates are rarely enough to cover the cost of meal service. So often that's supplemented through other means, including, of course, the state funding that we contribute, but then also other local revenue that they may have through a la carte sales or fundraisers, things of that nature.
Mr. Corte, I have a question. So we have the forms, the free and reduced forms that we ask family members to fill out to previously to our universal meals. The families were eligible for reduced or free lunches. And we are still collecting those documents. When you collect those documents and you have that identifiable student data and family information, does that have to be passed off to the Department of Agriculture in order to receive those dollars or those supplemental dollars?
Sure. Madam Chair, I believe how it works is that the schools identify through that process, so either through completion of the forms or through direct certification, where just as a reminder, if a family's participating in SNAP, TANF, MFIP, or some level of Medicaid, then they can be deemed automatically eligible. They don't have to fill out the paperwork. But the school will make that connection in their student information system, and that student is identified as free or reduced. And then that is submitted to us as well. We collect that data. I will have to check. My recollection, though, is that what goes up to the federal government in terms of those counts is at the aggregate level. It's not tied back to individual student level data, but we'll confirm that for you as well.
Thank you very much. I think Senator Gustafson had a comment or question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Actually, I have several questions about this program. So first of all, I have a list here of about over 60 schools who should be in CEP but are not, and that appears to be in violation of the Universal School Meals Law. So I'm wondering if you could walk through a couple of things. One, can you describe what CEP is to everybody who may not know? How schools qualify, and what are the benefits to being a part of that? And then I do have a couple follow-up questions, but if you could start there, that would be great.
Mr. Corte?
Sure, Madam Chair and Senator Gustafson. So CEP stands for the Community Eligibility Provision. This is an option that is offered through USDA as another way of receiving basically free school meals for your entire school population, despite what their individual income levels, household income levels might be. The way that it works is that the federal government submits eligibility criteria, which is that you have to have what's called an identified student percentage, or IFP, that is above, I think it's 40% right now. And the way that we calculate ISP is the number of students that you have that are directly certified for free or reduced meals, again, through those programs that we talked about earlier, either participation in SNAP, TANF, MFIP, or Medicaid. So if you meet that threshold, you can participate in the program. However, schools will tell you that unless your ISP is, IFP, I should say, is above 62.5%, then you won't receive as much funding as you would if you operated on a traditional free, reduced, paid status. So when we passed universal the Minnesota Free School Meals Act, it was included in there that if you had a identified student percentage of 62.5 or higher, you were required to participate in the community eligibility provision in order to participate in free school meals. As for those 60 schools that you're referencing, I think we're familiar with some of them that had basically 100% of their students who were free and reduced priced eligible in the first place. So by applying for this program, it really doesn't get them anything further. They're already serving all their schools under free school meals. I think some of them as well were smaller charter schools that weren't able to operationalize the free school meals program because of facility restrictions that they may have had. But others I may not be aware of or as sure of, but those are just things that we've kind of heard over the last year and a half or so of implementation of free school meals. Did that answer your question, Senator?
Senator Gustafson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes and no. One, we are, by not including these 60 schools, leaving federal dollars on the table. And so therefore, it's costing Minnesota more money to do the program that we didn't bargain for because these schools are not participating in it. And this isn't to say what the status of federal dollars are. If it goes away, that's a whole new conversation. I'm just assuming that things stay as is. Minnesota is leaving, isn't it millions of dollars on the table that we could be getting from the federal government for these CEP programs by not having these 60-plus schools involved in it?
Mr. Corte?
Madam Chair, Senator Gustafson, hard to say without, looking at those 60 schools and seeing what their individual circumstances might be. As I said, some of them may already be serving, all free school meals if they have a school that has all their students who are eligible through other means. That being said, it is a requirement for participation in the program of free school meals. So to the extent that they would choose not to participate in CEP, then they also couldn't participate in free school meals. So hard to say what the dollar amount would be, but conceivably, yes, if there were schools that met that criteria that were not participating, that is federal funds that would be left on the table.
Thank you. Follow-up?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. So I guess my question is, what is MDE doing to ensure that all the requirements of universal meals are being met? Like, can we expect that we will get current with the schools that are not participating so that we are not leaving that money on the table and then therefore costing the state more money?
Mr. Corte?
Sure, Madam Chair, Senator Gustafson, absolutely would love to get that list from you to make sure that there's nobody on there that's participating in free school meals and not participating in CEP as they should be, because we definitely want to make sure that that's not the case. The other piece, however, just to remind folks that free school meals is a voluntary program, so MDE can't mandate folks to participate in that program. But it is a requirement that if they do participate in the program and are eligible at that percentage for CEP, that they have to participate in CEP. So that's just the thing I would want to make sure that they're doing.
Thank you. Follow-up?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. So I'm happy to hear that there'll be a plan, and I am also happy to share that information with you because I think we need to be able to hold MDE accountable for those schools that are not participating or could be getting more dollars from the federal government. My final question is about the forms. There has been some sort of a discrepancy, and we have heard from a lot of school districts who are losing out on compensatory aid because there was a mixed message about forms. Now, just to go back a little bit in time, when we passed this bill for breakfast and lunch for all students in Minnesota, we still said that forms could be turned in. What we didn't want to do was hold a sandwich hostage because a kid didn't turn in a form, right? We don't want to hold kids responsible for things that are out of their control. That's really up to their family to do that. So if the form didn't get turned in, we didn't want to hold back food waiting on that form to show up. But now, because the law passed, breakfast, lunch are included for every student in Minnesota. However, we still need the forms so that schools get an adequate amount of funding and that compensatory aid. Some of them are losing millions of dollars, and that's not okay. So what I guess we're looking for is for MDE to clarify that those forms are still needed. We don't want to put that mandate on schools, but I think schools are willing to do that. I don't think they need to be mandated. They want to be able to have that funding, so it's not something that I think would feel onerous to them. In fact, I think they're anxious for any of your support or guidance on how to get those funds back to you, because it means that they're going to get the money that they need to operate in their schools. So what are you doing to clear up those, maybe that misinformation about why forms are still needed, and what can you do about compensatory aid?
Mr. Corte.
Sure, Madam Chair, Senator Gustafson, yeah, absolutely, you're right, that we still do ask districts and charter schools to get their families to fill out those forms. I'm a parent in Minneapolis Public Schools, and I certainly have been asked from our district to submit those forms. And I know that we have also sent out information through various listservs that we have through school leaders, so superintendents and charter school leaders, as well as the school nutrition director email reminding folks of the rationale for why we need that as well too, which is what you talked about as well, is that we want to make sure that we're taking advantage of every federal dollar that we can in order to keep the cost of Minnesota free school meals down. On the compensatory piece, I'm not as well versed in kind of how that has changed since free school meals came into the program. But that is certainly something I think we could follow up on in terms of what the plan is for communication around the compensatory piece.
Thank you. Senator Rarick, you had a comment?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. So I think there was a little bit of unclarity around one of the questions that was brought up that I want to make sure everyone is clear on. Around the CEP program, where we get the federal money, you're saying if a school is already at 100%, they're getting all federal funds to pay for those lunches. It's not costing the state anything. And if they've chosen not to participate in the program and they're not enrolled in CEP, it's actually not costing the state anything because they're not in the free meal program. Is that correct?
Mr. Corte.
Madam Chair, Senator Rarick, yes, that would be the case, that if there was a school that had 100% of their students who qualified for free school meals under the federal guidelines, then them participating in CEP would basically accomplish the same thing, that they would, in the same boat, they would all be receiving, all students at the school would be receiving their meals for free under the federal program, not the state program.
Follow-up.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So then the 60 or so schools that are not enrolled in CEP, the only way they are costing the state money is if somehow they are participating in the free meal program, which, right, they're required to be in CEP if they've engaged in the free meals, but likely if they're not in CEP, they have chosen not to participate in free meals as well.
Mr. Corte.
Sure. Madam Chair and Senator Rarick, so I think I understand your question, and yes, so if the requirement is that if you participate in free school meals and you have an identified student percentage of 62.5 or higher, then you have to participate in CEP. So that's, I was trying to clarify with Senator Gustafson, definitely want to make sure that everybody that's on that 60 list is not participating in free school meals or should be participating in CEP in order to participate in free school meals. But again, it's a voluntary program. We continue to grow it over time, which we knew would happen as the program, gains steam. But there are definitely still some schools that have chosen not to participate for a number of reasons, mainly facilities reasons. They don't have, kitchens or cafeterias of the size needed to implement the program.
And then Senator Gustafson, one more follow-up.
Yep, Madam Chair, thank you. As far as I know, and correct me if I'm wrong, there are only two are losing quite a few dollars. There's only two in the state that I know of that aren't participating. So I respect the question. I just don't know that it applies. We're still leaving lots of federal dollars on the table that we could be collecting for our state.
Thank you. And then Senator Makway.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm looking at the top of your slide, slide 30. And so Minnesota draws down funding from the USDA monthly. Am I reading that correctly?
Madam Chair, Senator McQuaid, that's correct.
Madam Chair, follow up?
Yep.
Thank you. So in another committee, in another world. I do a lot of work in the hunger relief and food instability world. And I know that there are organizations who are not currently able to draw down funds from USDA. They don't have contacts there anymore. Is that something that the Department of Education is experiencing, or are we monthly still being able to draw down our funds?
Mr. Corte.
Madam Chair, Senator McQuaid, at this time, we've been able to continually access our payment systems as we normally have been.
Thank you. Thank you. You may continue.
All right. I think we can go to the next slide. So this is just a helpful illustration, I think, of the funds that come in the various programs that are operated. You can see that the vast majority of funding goes to the school nutrition programs, that is National School Lunch and School Breakfast programs. A little over 3/4 of the funding goes for that. The next largest being CACFP, and then summer food service being a significantly smaller portion of that. You can also see that the vast majority of the funding that goes out through this program actually goes for meals. It's just a small amount that's held back for reimbursement at both the state and local level. So we definitely try and keep those numbers in that kind of consistent area so that we're getting as much of the funding out for food service as opposed to administration. All right. Unless there's any other questions about nutrition, I'll move on to charter school program grant. All right. So the Charter Schools Program Grant is a voluntary grant program that states can apply for in order to get funding to increase charter school quality and improve authorizer accountability. The states identify their own objectives when they apply for the grant. In Minnesota, you can see ours listed there, which is to facilitate student access, particularly for those students who are traditionally underserved, to get them access to high-quality charter schools. The main amount of money that this goes toward is providing funding to charter schools to either start up or increase their services through grade level expansion or site-based expansion or replication. One of the things with charter schools that you'll hear from charter school founders is the startup process can be very challenging, because really until you start serving students, you're not really receiving much money at all from the state or federal government. So this is funding that helps assist charter schools who are starting up, expanding, or replicating with all of those kind of pre-operational startup costs that that aren't otherwise covered through other state funds. So as we've kind of talked about other funds where in the absence of federal funds, kind of the state is required to step into the breach, this would be one where if these federal funds were paused or eliminated, there's really not an equivalent state level program that would be able to step in and fill the gap. And it's a significant amount of money here too. You can see it's about $37.5 million. We most recently applied for and were awarded the grant in September of 2023. I believe it's an 8-year grant. We're currently right in the middle of that grant cycle, and then annually we have schools that apply for either those startup or expansion and replication grants. And that's a competitive process, I should note as well too. Another piece on the charter school grant program is we go through an extensive notification process. There's also a budgeting process where they have to identify what their costs are going to be. There's also, this is another one of these programs, like most of them, where it's a cost-based reimbursement process where the schools have to incur those costs first and then they submit to us for reimbursements. It's a 32 or 36-month grant cycle, so they don't have to spend all those funds in the fiscal year in which it's received. They've got 36 months in which to do that. However, it does kind of scaffold down over the years because we want them to become less dependent on the grant and more accustomed to using traditional state funds like and federal funds like a more operational school district or charter school would. I think that's all I've got on the charter school programs grant. And I think I have one federal program to talk about before I'll hand it back to Assistant Commissioner Mansfield. All right, and that would be the Library Services and Technology Act, or LSTA funds. These are funds that are distributed through the Institute of Museum and Library Services. I think, on an overall basis, to all states, it's about $180 million annually. To state library administrative agencies, that funding is on a formula. It's based on population and number of eligibility factors, as well as there's some state matching funds that need to be kicked in as well. Minnesota receives a little over $3 million in LSTA grants. These are then distributed through competitive sub-awards to libraries and library support organizations, and then also supporting statewide initiatives as well, such as the Interlibrary Loan Program and the Blind and Print Disabled Program. You can see how that funding is broken up. The largest chunk of the funds goes to statewide initiatives. Once again, the libraries and library support organizations, Minitech's probably being the largest of those, and then the smaller portion being set aside for staff and operation salaries. Those being at MDE for the administration of the state library services and the Minnesota Braille and Talking Book Library. And I think with that, I'll hand it back to Assistant Commissioner Mansfield.
Thank you so much, Mr. Corte, and you may begin, Ms. Mansfield.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair and committee members. I am back with WEOA Title II implementation. WEOA is our Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, which supports our adult education and skills development programs. We have about $7.4 million, which the state has supplemented with matching funds. This federal funding is distributed across two main streams, about $6.3 million for federal adult education programming and a little over $1 million for integrated English literacy and civics education grants. The impact of these investments is substantial. During the 23-24 school year, these funds helped support services for an estimated 50,000 adults through 36 adult education consortia and 89 providers throughout Minnesota. The implementation process follows a clear structure. The federal legislature approves the national allocation, and the U.S. Department of Ed then determines Minnesota's share through a federal formula. Our ABE staff at MDE provide oversight, leadership, and mentoring and technical assistance to our grantees. Most of the funds are distributed to providers who demonstrate effectiveness in serving adults through a competitive multi-year grant process. To ensure accountability, MDE submits annual reports to the USDA Department of Education through the National Reporting System, and this program is also integrated into Minnesota's federally approved state WEOA plan. And then also our Perkins 5 implementation, which is a crucial piece of workforce development legislation. The Strengthening Career and Technical Education for the 21st Century Act of 2018, which is what we commonly and lovingly call Perkins 5. This legislation was designed to improve and expand high-quality career and technical education programs that meet the needs of both students and employers. For federal fiscal year 24, Minnesota has received an allocation of $21.4 million. The implementation of these funds follows a distinct structure due to our state's unique arrangement. Under Minnesota statute, our Minnesota state colleges and universities serve as the sole state agency authorized to receive and disperse the federal Perkins funds. The federal allocation process, requires that not less than 85% of Perkins Title I funds be distributed by formula to local education agencies, area career and technical schools, and community colleges offering eligible CTE programs. Our career and technical education staff at MDE play a crucial role in K-12 implementation. They oversee program approval, ensuring school districts meet federal requirements to access Perkins funding. Districts submit reimbursement requests based on pre-approved budget plans, and our team provides ongoing support for the establishment, expansion, and alignment of CTE programs with federal requirements. This work requires close collaboration between MDE and Min-State. Together, we provide annual reports to the U.S. Department of Ed through National Reporting System to ensure accountability and demonstrate program effectiveness.
Thank you so much for all your information and clarification. And Mr. Uni.
Madam Chair, committee members, if you'll indulge us just for, I'll do this in 2 minutes. We have
Okay.
2 more, I know we're over time. We have 2 more slides. I want to get through this so that members feel they've seen the whole presentation. We're happy
Appreciate
to
that.
follow up with any questions you have, but I'll continue on.
Thank you.
One of the handouts I believe the committee has is around federal impact aid, so you can see a run there. The federal impact aid, or Title VII, funds LEAs, or local education agencies with boundaries that are on federally owned land, or including Indian land, to make up for lost property tax revenue, or have increased expenditures for federally connected children.
Mr. Uni, if
Yep.
I could just point out, there is a spreadsheet in your packet that lists those items, just FYI. Go ahead.
A little bit more detail, Madam Chair, a little bit more detail kind of on that qualifying districts and you'll see, or qualifying LEAs, and you'll see that on the spreadsheet is children residing on Indian lands, military bases, low-rent housing properties or other federal properties, or have uniform services, parents in uniform services are employed on eligible federal properties. This is based on the count of federally connected school children, and it is paid directly to the LEAs. It's not through the Department of Education. And as you can see, the award in fiscal '24 was just over $16 million. The types of funds that this goes for, that the uses of the funds are payment for lost tax revenue due to being on federal property or having a coinciding boundary with federal property, basic support payments to help educate federally connected children, additional assistance for children with disabilities, and construction grants. The uses are highly flexible for these funds for capital or operating purposes, but the construction grants, the funding for children with disabilities has to be used for those purposes. So there are some flexibilities and there are some specific restrictions. And I just note that, you can see from the spreadsheet that there's, a wide geographic distribution, especially in greater Minnesota. There's a lot of benefits there from this federal impact aid. And then the final slide is just a reminder of the resources that the state received starting in 2020 due to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. It came in 3 phases for ESSER and GEAR, CARES Act in March 2020, Sarissa Act in December of 2020, and then the American Rescue Plan in March of 2021. As was noted before at the beginning of the presentation by Ms. Mansfield, the allocations to states and LEAs followed the Title I Part A formula, so you can see that there's a tie sometimes when the government responds to emergency situations to existing programs or existing structures that are set up, this one being through ESEA Title I and using that formula to drive a lot of the allocations. The ESSER, so the large bucket that the state received, was over $2 billion over these phases. And just a reminder, there was a smaller bucket called GEAR, Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund. This included almost $63 million in public school supports. I don't have the specific uses that were allocated for it memorized, but I do have that information that I can provide the committee. I believe we provided that to the committee in 2023 or 2024, but happy to find that information again for targeted purposes. And then there was over $82 million in services for non-public schools through the EANS program.
Thank you, Mr. Rooney. So these dollars are now depleted, correct? They are not available, or are school districts still receiving these emergency dollars?
So I believe that the final expenditure or drawdown was due by the September 30th, or there's a difference between encumbered and expended, but we are past the point where all those deadlines have passed, so it was through 2024. And we had a Madam Chair, we had a pretty very high expenditure rate from the districts on these.
So all of the dollars that we are eligible for have already been encumbered to the state? There's not anything sitting at the federal level, or are there still dollars that you can draw from for these unique funds?
Yeah, Madam Chair, I believe since the deadlines have been met, we've drawn what we're able to. There was an extension process that we, for, I think it was additional month or 60 days that LEAs could request, SEAs could request. I think we submitted a request for some of the minute projects that we may have, but we drew down from the SEA level practically all of what we needed or we could use to execute all of the plans that we put forward to the federal government. On the LEA level, I don't believe we had any LEAs request an extension, and we had an extremely high drawdown rate from them.
Thank you. And these are these were like one-time dollars to be spent to alleviate some of the struggles of school districts during the COVID time. This wasn't meant to like create a permanent funding source, is that correct?
Yeah, Madam Chair, yes, that's correct. This was in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. It was, I think the funds were available for 4 years, 3 to 4 years, depending on what the funding bucket was. I think the important note here is just a review of this is what we received as a bump from the federal government starting in 2020, and that it was tied to existing structures that set up. They provide a really good system for responding to emergencies. And to give a little explanation or detail around that table that you saw on one of the first slides that showed 1.4, 1.4, and then you saw it come down a little bit. That's because we had that still money that we were receiving or was being expended in the last 2 fiscal years from the ESSER funds.
Great, thank you so much. We now have, I'm going to open it up for questions. We're over time. If people have to leave, you may leave, but Senator Farnsworth.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I'm just going back one slide where you had the federal impact aid. And you answered, so I did have a question that you answered because I saw the amounts for tribal schools were quite a bit higher. And you explained that that was because they don't have a property tax base. And so that's good to know. I'm wondering, this committee, we've talked a lot about the permanent school trust and the fact that tribal schools don't get funds from the permanent school trust. Do these funds that you were talking about on page 39, is that also intended to help cover the fact that those students don't get, or the schools don't get permanent school trust funds for those students, or is that a completely separate issue?
Mr. Uni.
Madam Chair, committee members, the federal impact aid is a federal program connected mostly to for the purpose of making up for lost revenue due to being on federal land or having serving federally connected children. The school trust fund is a state program based off the resources that we have in the state and distributing them for the purposes of education. So they aren't particularly connected in terms of how they formally function. I can't speak to how people kind of think about that as a strategy of how to interconnect programs, but I'll just say that they don't rely upon one another, to the best of my knowledge.
Follow-up?
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. And that's good to know because I am sympathetic to the fact these are Minnesota kids and they don't get money from the, am I right, Madam Chair? They don't get money from the permanent school trust. So
If they are in a regular public school system, I believe they are, it's the 4 BIE schools that do not receive those funds.
okay.
Bureau of Indian Education, those are the schools that the federal government is wholly responsible for, but Minnesota makes up the difference again. Yep.
Okay, so that's just good information to know because if the federal government was making up the difference on that, on the permanent school trust payments, then it would be a different discussion. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Next we have, and are you okay, the 3 of you here for a little bit? Okay, thank you. Senator Swedzinski.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, I just want to thank all the counselors as well as what Senator Kunish, thank you as well. And I just want to thank you all. When you guys all became counselors, you thought you were going to be dealing with credit catch-up and career and college readiness, and the last thing you probably were prepared for is chemical dependency issues and therapy and crisis management and social workers and psychiatry and therapy. And so thank you for all the hard work that you guys have done over the last few years as our kids have struggled immensely. I also want to thank the three testifiers. I know Ms. Mansfield, you probably feel left out because the other two testifiers were referred to as senators today, so I just want to make sure I call you Senator Mansfield.
I appreciate it.
You're welcome. The other thing I've gained so much admiration and respect today for all the school financial officers, so to speak, and that they have to all these balls in the air, and your presentation just reaffirmed for all of us, I hope, that the burden that so many financial advisors for the school districts are going through right now. I do have one epiphany, if you will, of all the information you bestowed upon us today that I'm so grateful for. The one takeaway for me may be that there's 1,500 migratory kids in Minnesota, and I don't know what I would have guessed if somebody asked me that question, but to know that number is out there and that the federal government's cognizant of that special class of kids and that they can literally be going from state to state, and we need to keep an eye on them so that they don't get too far behind as they do what their parents need to do, I guess. And then lastly, I appreciate Senator Rarick's comments about not panicking, and but it could be argued this is one of those 5-alarm fires, and I have so much respect and admiration for my, I almost said co-chair, for the chair of this committee, Senator Kunish, and all the members of this committee for being proactive. And all we're trying to do today is react to today's paper. In the Star Tribune, it said that by the end of this month, the President of the United States will be, defunding the Department of Education. And what he's doing today, according to the Star Tribune, is he's starting to diminish in order to get ready for the defunding of the Department of Education. And so all the chair and members were trying to do today is be proactive and be ahead of the ball, and let's try to figure out what could end up being a pretty catastrophic impact upon kids and counselors and educators and bus drivers and lunch line ladies and all the people involved in this wonderful thing called education and getting kids ready to be the productive, engaged citizens that we all want them to be. And so we are in dire times right now, perhaps, and we're just trying to be prepared. And so thank you, the three of you, senators, for being here today and answering all the questions. It's been very edifying for me, and I can't thank you enough.
Thank you, Senator Swedzinski. And Senator Verbaden, you wanted to say something?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all for presenting. It's really helpful just to get this overview of the federal funding that's at play. And I would agree with you, Senator Swedzinski. I mean, I've been in contact with my school districts. I think a lot of them are just looking for guidance. It sounds like MDE is also looking for guidance. And so I do have one question, but want to share that I think a lot of the concern is the president is indicating that federal funding is going to go away, and potentially the Department of Education itself. That is money that, like, folks who were elected into office and are in the legislative body appropriated, and then to remove that through executive action is concerning. We've also seen from the department how much you depend on the Federal Department of Education to actually submit reimbursements and receive the funding. If those folks aren't there or staffed, how do we then get that money back to our district? So that's my concern. I appreciate getting the overview and being a little prepared about what's to come. So thank you so much for having this this conversation today, Chair Kunish. But just a question for you all is, like, what conversations have you had and guidance have you gotten from the Department of Education, if at all?
Mr. Uni?
Madam Chair, Senator Movabaten, that's a good question. I would have to go back and check with a range of teams. How it works is different teams who work with different federal programs. I'll be clear. In most cases, if not all, federal funding that comes to us for our staff, those staff can only work on federal programs, may work on state programs if they have, the Venn diagram is there for the actual substance of the work. They all have different teams that they work with. Some teams have, what I've heard anecdotally, is some teams have reached out for clarification on a range of issues and have heard back in various degrees, from acknowledgement receipts to maybe no responses. So we just have a little lack of clarity there. So I'm not entirely sure around the agency what level of guidance that we've received across the many programs that we have. So I guess that still leaves us with the impression we're still seeking clarity as we move forward.
Senator Lucero?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And things have been moving quick, and I've not been able to keep up to date with everything that's happening at the national level because we have a lot of irons in the fire here at the local level and the state level, many things that we need to address. But even though I've not been able to keep up, what I do know is the following. Americans across the country gave President Trump a mandate. The system is broken. Systems across the board are broken, including the Federal Department of Education. And I look forward to what he's going to do. We see this wailing and gnashing of teeth and this reactionary, emotional breakdown that's occurring, and I think a lot of it is premature. The fundamental objective of education in this country should be academic excellence and high achievement. And students across the country are performing worse and worse in the standards, not meeting what needs to happen at basic levels of reading, basic levels of math, especially when we are in a global environment of students in other parts of the world that are far exceeding the outcomes and achievement that American students are having, including Minnesotans. And so whether it be the Federal Department of Education, whether it be the Minnesota Department of Education, we continue to see this degradation of outcomes. Reform is needed. We don't need to tinker on the edges. And so what President Trump has begun, again, is something that is desperately needed, and he's acting upon the mandates that he was given. And we in the state of Minnesota, we as legislators, need to uphold what he is doing, because there might be some short-term destabilization to a broken system, but that is going to result in long-term gain and excellence for Minnesota students. So I look forward to the weeks and months ahead in this long overdue reform. So thank you so much, Madam Chair.
And our final comment is from Senator McQuaid.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I hope you're the final comment, to be honest with you.
Yes.
But I want to thank you for coming here. You know, it is really important that we understand where this federal funding is coming and when. I think the most illuminating part of today was to learn that a large portion of funds for districts, they already spend, and then they get reimbursed from the state. And the state has already spent it, and they get reimbursed from the federal government. Because right now, an unelected billionaire, not the president, an unelected billionaire and some college students have access to the U.S. Department of Treasury and have live launched new codes. I don't even know what that means. The U.S. Department of Education, they are working to dismantle it from within until Congress can repeal it. This is terrifying for every single American, no matter who they voted for. Am I going to get my Social Security payment? Is my kid going to have an IEP? Are they legally entitled to an education, or did we get rid of that with diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility? This is absolutely terrifying to families. I have been outreached to by people from across this state, across the political spectrum, wanting to know, do I have health care still? I'm pregnant. Do I still have access to WIC? This is not short-term destabilization. Children never get a day of reading back. They don't get a day of nutrition that they missed back. People who have cancer clinical trials, they don't get those days back. Short-term destabilization, well, wow, are we feeling it? And there is no way that this doesn't continue on, and we feel the effects long-term for our children and for our families. And so this was incredibly, incredibly helpful, and it sounds like there's even more information to get, not about what could be, but what actually is. And I wrote down a few of those things. I'm really concerned about the data of our students and of our teacher. I want to be sure that we can safely transmit data to the federal government and that it is protected. I want to make sure that we know where these federal funds, if they get turned off in, let's say, June, when we're not in session, what do we do? If it gets turned off in September, when we're not in session, what do? We have to build a budget, but we are time-bound. We end session in May. We have to build a budget for 2 years. We can't even say what's going to happen 2 hours from now. So it was very, very important. I want to thank you, Madam Chair, for having this hearing, and I want to thank the department for coming in this wildly unknowing present that we are living in, minute to minute, day to day, hour to hour, because I don't know how we build a budget right now, not knowing if 10% or more of our funding could be turned off, or to some students, or to some schools, or to some districts. And so I feel really uncertain on how we do that. That is the task at hand. But we demand some stability from our federal government, some normalcy on how we proceed. We can make big structural changes. I voted for Elizabeth Warren in a primary. I love structural change. But we don't have to throw kids' lives into turmoil and their families into fear in order to do that. And that's what's happening right now.
So on that note, yes, I want to thank you, all three of you, for diving into this whole subject around the federal funding, as it will affect our students and our teachers and our school districts. Our job here is to create a budget that is going to ensure a free and appropriate education for our students. And I'm not sure I can do that. When you talk about panic, you bet I'm panicked. I don't sleep at night because I'm thinking, how are we going to do this? I don't know. We don't know. And it's just as Senator Mayquade said, it's every 2 hours we hear something else. How do you plan for that? And when school districts come to us asking us for guidance, and when school districts come to us and say, am I going to get those dollars? And when school districts come to us and say, how are we going to plan for next year and the next year and the next year? I have no answer for them because we don't know. And so, should we panic? Hell yeah. And we should all be panicking because these are our students. These are the children of the future, of the present and of the future. And what's going to happen if we can't feed them? What's going to happen if we can't provide the curriculum that is necessary? What if we can't provide occupational therapists and speech therapists and school counselors? Senator Lucero said, oh, a little instability is going to be maybe for a little while and then we'll get really great. He doesn't know that. We don't know that. No instability is good. And so today's hearing was to at least inform us of the things that we have to be looking at and we have to be prioritizing on, and we have to be ready to address, should there be a shortfall, should there be strings attached to some of the most important funding, like special education, our students with disability, transportation, any of those things. And so thank you all for bringing this information to us in such a great way. And I know we give you a short amount of time, but you put together an extraordinary package. Thank you to the senators that stuck around and listened and asked really good questions. And thank you to the communities that are listening and watching, because we're going to be in a bit of a hurt here and we're going to need all of your support. So thank you very much. Our next hearing is tomorrow, where Senator Rarick will be in charge. Following this week, we will be going back to the regular scheduled program with just me as the chair. But we do encourage and hope that you will all bring us good bills and good recommendations. And just a reminder that there is no hearing on Thursday. And with that, we are adjourned.